Hi there, and welcome to Revise the Right Way with me, Mr. Bell. Today we're going to look at the importance of place in The Great Gatsby, and we're going to try and answer the question on the right here: how does F. Scott Fitzgerald make location so important in The Great Gatsby? So we're going to look at, in particular, at some of these concepts. We might even talk a little bit about the title and the way in which it kind of links to location, but for now, we're going to jump straight in by looking at the first location, and that is, or the first location I would like to focus on, the eggs of New York. So we have two different eggs called West Egg and East Egg, and you can see here that I've highlighted some of the ideas that and written about it on the right, that it's referred to as one of the strangest communities. And the reason why I want to focus on that is because if you look at the title and you look at the name The Great Gatsby, and I'm going to highlight it again, it almost sounds as if it's some kind of circus attraction, some kind of spectacle for people to like roll up, come and see The Great Gatsby, as if it's something maybe not to laugh at, but something strange that you kind of curious to go and have a look at, and you maybe simultaneously you want to see it, but also it's not very pleasant to see it, or maybe to see what it becomes. By the way, if you're watching this video and you haven't read all of Great Gatsby, come back when you have. There are going to be spoilers, and I'm going to assume that if you're watching this video, you already know the text and you already know what most of the things that I'm going to talk about. Well, hopefully not all of them, otherwise there's no point watching it. Anyway, I always talk about this idea of the word the being really pivotal. And if something is referred to as the rather than a, and so you can kind of cross out the word a day to enjoy is not as significant as the greatest day, the Great Gatsby. So whenever you're adding the word the, you're saying that it's specific and therefore important. What is also interesting is that his name is Gatsby in the title, not J. Gatsby, not even his real name. Okay, so his constructed identity is not even in the title. We all refer to this book that's from the American canon of literature, but it doesn't even refer to the guy's name as his actual name, and that's important because it's all about this sense of identity, and how does that tie into the sense of identity in terms of these locations. Now, if you go further on and look at the way in which the kind of like the slender riotous island, which extends itself due east, it's personifying them, but it's also suggesting that the inhabitants of these islands are in some ways victimized by the location. And we're going to get more into this idea of victimization when we get into the Valley of Ashes. These people are exploited by other people. So you could argue, is it the location that's important, or is it the people who are living in these locations? The whole point of the West and East Egg is that it divides communities, and it divides communities even further when you tie in the Valley of Ashes and think about like the geographical and topological idea behind that. So the idea as well, when it says later in this passage that they're not perfect ovals, they're crushed flat, is suggesting, and I've put that it's saying that they're not perfect, but more so that the inhabitants of these places are being crushed by expectations placed upon them. They can't escape from their social classes. They think that they can, and that's partly the backdrop of this, that 1920s, post World War One, people are trying to change the kind of old-fashioned class system where you were born into the richness of a certain family, and if you weren't, that's unlucky, but that's unfortunately a lot. So they're not perfect, because in some ways what that's doing is foreshadowing the fact that Caraway himself knows that these places are not perfect. And he also talks about the fact that they look similar, but they're dissimilar in every other way except for the shape and size. And that's important because he's basically saying to us from the very beginning, these people don't belong. These people cannot coexist. And there's a very clear hierarchical system in place. And if we move on to that idea of class divide, we have this quote which I had at the very beginning about the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water. So you got these quotes here, white palaces and glittered, which all have connotations of kind of purity and wealth, but have also suggested that maybe this is a facade because it's existing along the water, and water ripples and changes and adapts. And the point is, if you link it to the idea of like this being maybe a pretense, well, Jay Gatsby was born as James Gatz. He was born and died of the water. And for those of you who remember and are aware of this, he came into this because of his link to Dan Cody. Dan Cody was another rich guy who kind of helped to create this persona of Jay Gatsby. So even his own identity that's been constructed. Okay, it's not the white palaces of fashionable East Egg, but it flows like water, and water is an important point to this text because it's constantly referred to as this extended metaphor or this repeated idea all the way throughout. So therefore, water takes on meaning, particularly when you look at the way in which the Valley of Ashes is bounded by a disgusting river. So always water is close by, and water has very similar connections to life, particularly when you think about the fact that when, yes, he's born and dies of the water, he doesn't go in his swimming pool, and the only time he does, he gets killed, which is unfortunate if you want to get more usage out of your swimming pool. It's a weird way of putting it. Anyway, the point as well on the right is Tom and Daisy are taking an interest in Nick, who's sort of engaged to a girl. It's not really clear. They had their banns read out in or announced in the paper, which kind of implies that he did know about it. So in some ways, there's this suggestion that maybe he was running away. But as he's driving, as he's leaving the home of Tom and Daisy, it says that I was confused and a little disgusted. And there's a clear link here between F. Scott Fitzgerald and Carraway. F. Scott Fitzgerald has kind of described himself as like a weird combination of Gatsby and Carraway. He is simultaneously, and this is in real life, and he's repulsed by the excesses of like the 20s, the roaring 20s, the Prohibition era, but he's also drawn into it. So he's kind of like both on the sideline, the periphery, like Nick Carraway, but he's also involved in this. And that makes it hard to detach him. It also makes it hard for us to look at Carraway as a completely reliable narrator. So moving on to similar idea, but also a different location again. We get back from Carraway visiting, and he sees his neighbour, and he knows that his neighbour is called Gatsby, and he sees him stretching his arm out towards the green light. It's such an iconic moment in this text. It's something that everyone kind of knows if they know this text. And the irony in this opening is that it says he was content to be alone, except he isn't. Throughout the entire book, he's driven by this urge to possess Daisy, and possess is probably a strong word there, but it's maybe the right word. And I think what this does is foreshadows the fact that he is going to die, and he is going to have this decline in terms of he's isolated, nobody cares about him once he dies. So this content to be alone is more a sense of that's his reality. So it foreshadows the fact that he is going to die, or at least I think it might. And then as well as that, we have this single green light, and I've written down here that minute or minute, it's obviously meant to be minute as in small, but it is a homonym, which basically means that you have the same spelling, same sound, different sound here, but a different meaning. So if you look at minute and minute, minute is small, but time, a minute, well, it's still a relatively small amount of time. And if we see it as being an indicator of time, minute and far away, I think ties into this idea that, and a super famous quote that he says, can't repeat the past, why of course you can. He doesn't think that the distant past is in the past. He's constantly reaching for something that maybe he can't get. And the unquiet darkness in the end of this scene is tied into this idea of lots of juxtaposition between noises in this scene. It talks a lot about the natural world, and it's something that doesn't happen very often in the text. But it's that combination of the darkness, which is the foreboding element or the foreshadowing of his death, alongside the unquiet. Nothing can be quiet, and maybe that's something tied into his own mind. And whether we're talking about Gatsby, whether we're talking about Caraway, those are kind of interchangeable here. Okay, so then we get into the next location that I'd like to focus on, the Valley of Ashes. And I'll just pause for a second while we read this because it's a long section. You may want to pause the video and just read it before I talk about it too much. And if you have paused it and you've read it, that's great. If not, we'll just talk about it and you can kind of follow along. But here's the highlights. And what I've particularly focused on are a couple of different things. And I hope this is helpful in looking at the importance of location. So first of all, we've got the alliteration in Fantastic Farm and Grotesque Gardens. Now, alliteration always tells us that there's a continuity, that things are continuing to happen. Okay, so here, the irony is we have fairly negative descriptions of Grotesque Gardens alongside Fantastic Farms, but it's describing something which is negative. I think, again, it has this idea of being both repulsive and appealing, this kind of like, wow, this is amazing, but it's really not that nice. And it's Caraway's kind of amazement at this place, which is a result of the actions of the people around. They exploit this place. And so, as well as the exploitation, I also think that what's interesting here is, that's a different colour, but it maybe fits, the supernatural semantic field. So semantic field, if you're not aware, is basically a fancy way of saying group of words that are connected. So here we have words like ghastly, grotesque, transcendent, impenetrable cloud, and ashes taking the form of houses. You can imagine this in some kind of ghostly horror movie, perhaps. And this is against the backdrop of this like splendor in terms of the West and East egg both being presented positively. You have this negative description, and then as well as this, the people who live there are described as crawling, swarming, insect-like behavior, which is dehumanizing, which is ironic because we have these characters like Tom and Daisy who are presented as really important, and yet here we have ash grey men who are almost, when something turns to ash, it's been destroyed, it's been, it's dead basically, and it just performs a function. And I think that's a really interesting idea about this location. It exists to be exploited. And when it says later on, it screens the Ash Grey Men's obscure operations. I tied this into, and I've talked about this previously on my Instagram, because I really like this idea. It's a fancy word, but it basically, this word obfuscation means creating like a false identity. And I've linked this to the idea that like Tom uses the Valley of Ashes to cover his affair with Myrtle, but then she also exploits the Valley of Ashes in some ways, but then she herself is killed by Daisy, so maybe she takes advantage of that, and maybe Gatsby is being taken advantage of, but also taking advantage of others. He acquires his wealth through illegal means, and I've also added in George, who eventually takes the life of Gatsby, and all that's left behind of these 5 characters is Tom and Daisy, and they're none the wiser. They haven't learnt any lesson. They just move away. We don't know when they're going to come back. So this location, in some ways, is maybe more important than the eggs, because the eggs are this weird growth, and it's almost like they've been hatched out of society, or they're not ready to hatch yet, and it's the growth, but also, F. Scott Fitzgerald is writing that without knowing that we're going to have the Wall Street crash, without knowing that we're going to have the Great Depression. The Wall Street crash is 1929, by the way. And so this is ironic that there's a kind of foreshadowing in terms of his own ideas here, in terms of what will happen in the real world. So all of this is suggesting that this place is used, abused, this kind of bounded on one side, like I said before, the small foul river and the dismal scene that can be stared at. Again, that staring at the dismal scene reinforces the circus-like elements. This kind of just sit and stare and gawp at how crazy this whole place seems. And the section that I've cut out, and I just double-checked that it was the bit that I cut out, in between the paragraph the first paragraph and the third and the second paragraph here, there's actually this paragraph which describes Dr. T.J. Ecclesburg, who is a personified billboard. He's a sign, basically, but he is an important character, and in some ways he's similar to Allise. If you've looked at Allise as being the only character who seems to know what's going on with Gatsby and how he's kind of fake but nobody else sees it. And Dr. T.J. Ecclesburg is a pair of eyes on a billboard with yellow spectacles, and this idea of yellow, do you know what, let's highlight it in yellow because that's important, is referred to at times as kind of pale gold. And I've just put in here a few quotes, and you can use them as quotes in your exam if you want, but where we get colour being used. And what I would advise you, if you have a digital copy of The Great Gatsby, I would suggest that you search for colours and see how often certain colours like gold and yellow and green are used, and think about why. So the whole idea here is that yellow is like a pale imitation, like a fake version of gold. And when you look at it, it's describing Dr. T.J. Ecclesburg as brooding over the solemn dumping ground. So this kind of sad place where things are left to die, to decompose, to be destroyed. But at the same time, by other characters on the left here, you can see that Wilson, George Wilson here, refers to it as God and says that God sees everything. And this is the point where Myrtle has been killed, and Michaelis tells him that's an advertisement, that's advertising something, which is true. It's advertising a few different things, and obviously you can look at T.J. Ecclesburg in more detail. He's basically representative of capitalism, of a consumerist society, and absolutely he's an advertisement for a way of life, because he shows people like Gatsby and people like George and Myrtle a better life, a better way of being. If you can climb up that slippery slope, and excuse my terrible drawing here, but when you think about a valley of ashes, a valley is designed to have high sloping walls, and the whole point of that is that this section here is inescapable. For the people who are in this, they can't get out. So it's this frustration that what's happening is that they put people like T.J. Ecclesburg on a pedestal, like Daisy when Gatsby says that she represents this better life for him, but also other people when they go to the parties put Gatsby on this pedestal. He's this amazing person, and he turns out not to really be this amazing person, except Caraway sees him as a pretty amazing person. So it's a little bit confusing, but this idea of T.J. Ecclesburg being representative of like false idols, and this whole idea that the entirety of East Egg is being elevated as this really important location. If you can make it to there, then you've made it, because you're old money, not new money, and old money is more prestigious, more valued. So location here takes on this idea that, like America, you attribute certain emotional attachments to images, to places, to people, and you elevate them. It's like the American dream. That's what you want. Okay? And then from there, now that we've talked about a few different locations, I want you to have a look at this quote here, this whole passage. And this is after Gatsby has died. And Caraway is reflecting, and he says at the end that there's a car that drives up, doesn't know that parties aren't happening, and it's this final guest who had been away at the ends of the earth and didn't know that the party was over. And if you're following along and doing this as like a mini lesson, then I'd like you to actually try and answer that question. What is the significance of these two quotes? Look at them individually, because the ends of the earth has interesting connotations and implications. And that final phrase, didn't know that the party was over, I want you to look at it both literally and metaphorically and tell me what you think. And if you want to quote, write a post and a response below, that would be awesome. And if you're doing this as one of my students in a lesson, then you can post that for me as well, and that would be great. Once you've done that, I've got another section, and I'd like to ask the same sort of question in a moment, but what I want to highlight before I get onto the question is that when you look at it, this is Carraway sat brooding on the old unknown world in the same way that Dr. T.J. Ecclesburg was described as brooding too. And I want you to think about what that suggests about the two roles. Dr. T.J. Ecclesburg is an inanimate object. He doesn't do anything. What does that tell you or suggest about Carraway? Again, I'm just asking you questions and you don't have to know the answers, but any ideas that you've got would be great. And then once you've had a think about that question or that idea, I would also like you to have a go answering this question, and again, put your ideas below. How effective is this passage, is this section here, in summing up Gatsby's journey? What does it tell us? What do we learn? How effective is it as almost like a eulogy? When somebody dies, you're kind of talking about their life and what they achieved and what they didn't achieve. So I want you to think about how effective this is in that. And once you've done that, basically that is the end of this video, looking at the importance of location, and I hope that that was helpful. One of the things that I'm aware of is that some of this material may be useful to your peers or to friends in different schools. Feel free to share this with your friends if you know somebody else who might benefit from this. I'd love you to subscribe, but obviously I'm just doing this to try and help you and all of my students out. So I hope you enjoyed watching, and thank you very much.